Welcome, everyone, to this week's episode of 15 Minutes and a Big Idea. We're glad to have you with us as we continue our journey through the book of Philippians. If you haven't taken a second yet, stop what you're doing, or as we're going through this, go like our Facebook page, go follow us on Instagram. Make sure you're following those pages. Subscribe to us if you're watching on YouTube. Go ahead and hit subscribe to the Mended Collective. Click the bell for notifications so that way you can never miss an episode of 15 Minutes and a Big Idea on YouTube or any other of the excellent content the Mended Collective is coming out with at this point. Also, if you get the chance, just share this podcast with somebody. This podcast continues to grow and has grown in the last year in ways I've never expected, and that's all to you who are a part of this community. I'm thankful for each and every one of you. So we've got a huge text today. It's only 2 verses, but in terms of ideas and their centrality to the gospel and what they're about and forming the way Christians should think about things, they are super important. So we're going to go and just dive right in to Philippians chapter 1, verses 21 and 22. Paul says, "For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But if I to live on in the flesh, this will mean fruitful labor for me. And I don't know which to choose." Today, we're going to be studying one of the most powerful and compelling texts in all of Paul's letters. And really, it might be one of the most powerful and compelling and transformative texts in all of the Bible. You know, in each of the books that I've selected, you kind of stand back on the outset of it, and you've heard the books before, you've read them before, you've heard them taught on. So there's certain passages that kind of stick in your mind. It's like, yeah, I'm looking forward to studying in and diving in on that one and teaching on it. And this is one of the 3 or 4 that I've really had in my mind that I've just been really excited to dive into and to share with you. In fact, I was so excited about it, and I so wanted it to go well, that I considered going from 3 ideas to 2 ideas. So from 3 ideas to 2 ideas, supporting ideas. And for those of you who've been around, we're 178 or 9 episodes in and haven't changed the format once. So it's pretty sacrosanct at this point. But I really believe this text turns our world upside down, and I want to try to get that across to you. So let's get some background here. Paul said that he sees the blessing and benefit of being in prison because more people are preaching the gospel. Even those who are doing it out of false motive, Paul's able to find joy because at the very least Christ is proclaimed. Their motive may be wrong, but the content of what they're saying is not incorrect. More than that, he rejoices in everything because he knows he's getting out of this cell, and he's bold in Christ because of that. He has confidence that Christ is going to be magnified in him. Last week, we left off by seeing that Paul's stunning source of confidence is that he would be delivered in prison in a way that people might not expect. It wasn't because he knew what was going on behind the scenes politically. It's because he knew that it would happen by life or by death. Paul knows that his existence is not eternally bound to the cell. Rather, for him, death would be a means of deliverance. Death itself would be a means of deliverance. So how can Paul be so satisfied in either situation of life or death? How can he be so confident and satisfied with either? Well, today we'll look at what Paul has to say about that. Why is Paul so satisfied? Well, our big idea today is that life or death is a win-win. Life or death is a win-win. To understand what we mean by that, we're going to look at number 1, living is Christ. Number 2, dying is gain. And number 3, life means fruitful labor. Living is Christ, dying is gain, and life means fruitful labor. So Christ, gain, and labor are the words that we'll see as we go forward. Coming into this first idea, we always want to note it begins with the word for. That's a conjunction that denotes the causality between this section and the last one. What we're reading today is giving the reason for what we read last week. This is essentially doing what our introduction promised. It's telling us why is it that Paul can be confident in life or death. It's telling us that what we're about to read is the reason that Paul is satisfied in any state. Now, why is that? He says because for him, living is Christ and dying is gain. What does Paul mean by living is Christ? He's going to give more of a description in the final point about the ways in which that'll play out, but what does he actually mean by it? If you think about it, the phrase doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Living is Christ. I mean, we might say living means glorifying Christ, or living means knowing Christ, but that's not what he says. And this is going to be a little bit of a longer point, because I really want to try to pull on this and try to get in our heads what he's talking about. In some sense, Paul means that living is equal to Christ. Living means Christ. Those are the same. They're two sides of the same coin. That is, the reward of living is Jesus. Why is life actually life in and of itself? It's because of Christ. And here in this case, he's probably referring to his unity with Christ. The way he lives is so full of the knowledge, character, and actions of Christ that Paul truly understands Jesus on the deepest level. For Paul, in a very real sense, it is no longer he who lives, but Christ who lives in him. Christ is so in control of Paul that when people look at Paul, there's an identification and an embodiment of who Jesus is. Jesus is so at work in the actions and words and thoughts of Paul that as someone looks on, they look on and they see Paul undertaking an action. It's like if you just kind of blur your eyes or you're not quite looking carefully, you're like, wait, is that Paul or Jesus? There's such an identification and a unity and a copying of the example of Jesus in the actions of Paul that almost, is it Christ or is it Paul, is an indistinguishable question. Paul's saying that life is valuable as an end only because it is connected to Christ. He does not say life is good because it is. He says life would be great or death would be great. That's not what he says. He says life is Christ. For Paul, if there is no Christ in life, it's not really life. It's counterfeit. It's like watching something in black and white instead of color. You can get the sense of it, but there's not the true richness of the experience. Similarly, if we were watching or reading or listening to an account of something versus the actuality of living it, of going through it, of hearing the words spoken to us, of experiencing the emotions, those are the differences between life with and without Christ. That with Christ, the life we have has true meaning and significance and importance. Paul values the experience of life with Christ. While Paul's experience of Christ will be further heightened and deepened upon his death, Paul's experience of Jesus in this present moment is of such a substance and a realness and truth that its rapture and joy are sufficient in and of themselves to bring contentment to life. That the difficulty of what Paul is going through, though there is the promise of Christ coming and furthering that unity, means he's going to love it now because of how good it is. His knowledge and relationship with Jesus is going to gain a whole nother level of dimensionality at his death. But in the interim, Christ is of such a surpassing value that Paul finds satisfaction and contentment in it. Yet for our second point, we have perhaps as significant of a revelation. Paul says to die is gain. We're only going to take a quick glimpse at this because really understanding that's going to come next week. For now, we're going to just see the substance of what he's saying and how radical and revolutionary and reformative it is for our current experience. Much of what it means to be human is lived through the lens of avoiding death. Much of what it means to be alive is the ability to avoid death. As humans, we take precautions against death. And we structure our societies around the idea of preserving life. We create laws, expectations, and frameworks of behavior around the idea that life is valuable and its protection is of the utmost importance. And like few other things, we punish the taking of life. I looked at the U.S. Code, and I'm not a great lawyer, but the website that I found listed 33 capital crimes. Those are crimes which can gain the death penalty. And only 2 of them, treason and espionage, for those of you who are keeping score at home, don't require the killing of another person. That is, out of the 33 things that can get you killed, for 31 of them, you have to kill somebody else. That tells us the significance of not killing other people that we place on life, but also that we don't just throw around the death penalty for any little thing. It requires something significant. Further, in the U.S. alone, we spend about $4.3 trillion on healthcare. That's about how much we spent in 2021, which is about how much money the IRS took in from all the people together. An absolutely incredible amount of money. And to give you a little more context there, 4 trillion $1 bills stacked end to end long ways would reach to the sun and back twice. An incredible, incredible sum of money. And about 10% of that incredible sum of money, or $400 billion, is spent on end-of-life care. To give you an idea, that is about the intake for the states of California and New York in terms of collections for state income tax. An incredible amount of money. Two of the richest states in the country. An incredible amount of money gets spent on end-of-life care, which is the medical care that we give when a person's life is about over. And at that point, we're spending $400 billion to extend the life of a person by days or weeks or hours, or keep them comfortable because we hold it dearly. And let me be clear. When I talk about the shockingness of that number, of the amount of money we spend to extend life by a few weeks or days or months or hours even, I'm not putting that down at all. I'm not disparaging that care. If you've walked through with a loved one through their final hours, you know that sort of care and keeping them comfortable is very, very, very important. What I'm pointing out is that's the amount of money spent because of how valuable it is to us. As part of humanity, we believe that holding on to life is good. But for Paul, he says that death would be a gain. Christ has so transformed everything about him that he thinks dying would be a gain. We'll see next week why that is. Last, I know we're taking a little time here, but these ideas are so important for us as Christians. Last of all, we read that Paul says, if I'm to live on in the flesh, that'll mean fruitful labor for him, but I don't know which direction I'm going to go. For Paul, as our big idea says, he's not sure which direction to go because either way is a win-win. What does life look like for Paul? Why would either one of those options be positive? Note, his concern is not for his personal joy. It's like, well, I'm going to get it. It's going to be great either way. Rather, he thinks life itself is worthwhile because it means fruitful labor. In his prayer for the Philippians, notice he prayed that they would be filled with the fruits of righteousness. Paul wants them to keep living because he sees the opportunity for more ministry for them to grow as Christians. And he wholeheartedly believes that if he's going to continue, he continues living on, that Christ is going to be magnified in his work. Paul's motivation for continuing life, living as Christ, and the blessings that life would entail means more ability to do things for Jesus. Paul doesn't want to get out of prison so he can work on his tan. He doesn't want to do that so he can see his family, or he can make it rich, or he can get a boat or a lake house, or he can get a new job, a new business endeavor, whatever that might be. Any of the countless things we spend our lives on, Paul's like, that's not what I'm about. The reason I want to get out of here isn't so I can kick back and take it easy. It's so I can be about the work of the kingdom and magnifying Christ through me. This is probably most likely what Paul means by the idea that life is Christ. That for him, going through and showing who Jesus is to the people around him is an integral part of who he is and what he does. That in living, he is displaying Jesus to the people around him, and he is confident. He's confident that if he goes out and he lives and shows who Jesus is and embodies him, that means there will be fruit. The fruit that Paul has confidence in is not of himself, but of Christ in him, and he is sure of it. Let's wrap this up. Paul sees both death and life as having benefits. Life is a benefit because of his intimate union with Christ, which gives him purpose and meaning. He says that if he continues living and demonstrating his union with Christ, that means fruitful labor through the exaltation of Christ. We may wonder why our lives are so miserable and why we don't have the joy of Christ, and perhaps it is because our priorities are so radically different. So much that the priorities we have, Paul would find totally unrecognizable. Where we dread and try to avoid and ignore work in the kingdom of God, and we fear death. Many of us avoid or downright despise exactly the things that gave Paul's life meaning and joy. No wonder we don't have joy that transcends our circumstances, because our priorities are completely misaligned. If we want the joy that Paul has, we have to have the mind that Paul has. And that means that we see life and death as a win-win, that we have the promise of gain through our death, and that living means unity with Christ. Because life in and of itself is not good enough. You must have Christ with it. And when we have the joy of Christ, we have Christ inside of us. That's whenever we can experience something that is transcendent. So let's ask questions. What do you think about death? What sort of emotions or feelings arise when you ponder it? Do you feel fear? Or has the hope of Christ replaced that fear? Do you dread the thought of your life ending? Or do you face it with confidence? What purpose are you living for? What gives your life meaning? When you think about why your life matters, is it education or family or work or hobbies, or do you find it in Jesus? Do you find it in labor in his kingdom or in labor for your own rewards and goals? Is the reason your life is miserable or a dread for you because you're striving for things that won't satisfy? How can you grow deeper in love for Christ and hope in Christ so that you might have the joy of Christ? Thank you so much for joining us today on 15 Minutes and a Big Idea. Today's big idea: life or death is a win-win.